All right, welcome to week 4 of the 12 Rules for Life analysis. This week we're going to be talking about Rule 4. Rule 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. I had a lot of fun reading this chapter I guess listening to this chapter because I'm kind of cheating and listening to the audiobook. But I think last week I said something to the effect of Rule 3 was like the most relatable rule. And then Rule 4, I feel like, is the most readily recognizable rule in the 21st century, especially for people that are struggling with just being stagnant in life. So, whether it's people that are depressed or people that are like struggling with addiction.
Yeah. I feel like it's also the rule that's like easiest to just apply like instantly and like easily see enacting like rule 3, it's hard to see. It's hard to make new friends and like find new friends and stuff like that to put yourself in a better scenario, but this one's like, oh, like you can do the simplest things like start brushing your teeth or whatever tomorrow,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and that stems from like one of his one-liners that made him popular, where it's like clean your room, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was like one of the first things I heard from him, and one of the great things about this rule is just that like he also says this idea in a lot of his interviews where it's like stop looking at like the world, or like stop criticizing the world or other people, and stop being so judgmental because you have so much to do in your own life.
Yeah.
And it's like something that I've started to realize or recognize more is that a lot of times, like when I feel particularly shitty or when I feel like I'm really stuck, typically it's when I have my mind or my hand in someone else's business when I have absolutely no reason to, and I'm only doing that
Mhm.
to distract it from the fact that I have bigger issues that I got to deal with in my own life too, that I just don't want to deal with at the time.
Yeah, I feel like that happens a lot when I get really online and like get really into like being on Twitter and like watching YouTube. It's
Yeah.
like when I'm so focused on like other people's issues or like YouTube drama, like every once in a while I go down that down that rabbit hole, and you're just like, oh, like David Dobrik's having issues with what's his face or whoever, PewDiePie's in the news again. And it's like, oh, dealing with all that kind of BS where it's like, oh, maybe I should just focus back on like I haven't been to the gym in a week. Like,
Yeah, no kidding, dude. I remember there's this one time where we were. I think you had invited me over to study, and then earlier that week you were like, "Oh my god, like I'm wasting so much time on Twitter. I'm gonna delete it." And your girlfriend was over at the time too. And when I came over, uh, I was just like sitting on your couch, and like you had your back turned to both of us, and you were like glaring at your computer screen. I'm like, "What you doing?" And then you like look over your shoulder, and like as you did that, I could see like hints of Twitter like on in the background after you said, "Oh, I deleted that shit," and you're like, "Nothing."
yeah, I
Yeah,
feel
it's
like I'm
addictive.
Yeah, I'm back on Twitter. I feel like I'm doing better this time, but that could just because I'm on a break from school for like the month, so maybe I don't notice. But I'll see what happens when go back, like, when the semester starts and stuff, or my rotation or whatever.
Do you feel like a physical change when you're just like hooked on Twitter or hooked on any sort of social media or any outlet to where you're just excessively focused on another person or like lives that are beyond yours? Like what is it that you feel?
I feel like unfortunately a lot of times it's just getting mad at shit. Like, you see like all because Twitter is like I feel the easiest way to show you like the most extreme examples of anything, or like show you like how ridiculous people can be. So you just sit there getting mad at everyone.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, I think this time because I did delete it and then I came back and I think purging like all those accounts because I
Mm-hmm.
was off it long enough that it just deleted my account, so I had to start over. And so now I'm following a lot more like just fun, silly things, like there's like this whole little microcosm of Twitter that they call the Critterverse, and it's just all these like people pretending to be like otters and bears and stuff that's just kind of fun. So it's like a lot less like being angry at political stuff and more like here's this silly otter, and he's like, oh, Otter Team 6 is training today. So it's like a
Oh
lot more
shit.
fun, at least. But
Wow,
uh,
that's kind of cute. I had a similar problem with like Facebook and Instagram.
mm,
It's not like I was posting regularly or anything, or I I really pretty much only used it like in the past maybe 3 or 4 years now, just as a means of like communicating with people, because sometimes it's just easier to type on a keyboard to someone rather than just using your phone to text, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
like something that I sort of started to realize too. I think I was watching a YouTube video, ironically enough, that was telling me
Mm,
about this, where it's like the idea that uh, if you're not paying for a product, then you are the product.
yeah.
And for some reason, like I keep thinking about that, and so I started. I think this was maybe about a month ago, because that's around when I deactivated my Facebook and Instagram, and I noticed that like a lot of times like I just started buying like a lot of stupid shit off of like ads on Instagram or Facebook that
Mm,
I just did not need. And then I started
yeah.
looking at my bank account statement. I'm like, I'm losing so much money so quickly. And then I had to take a step back and I was like, oh my God, like it's not just like my attention that they're consuming now. It's literally like my financial resources. And I was like, okay, now I have to start seeing my attention as like a resource,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I feel as though like especially when you're younger, we're both in our mid 20s, but when you're younger, you just like time isn't a real thing. Like
Hmm. Yeah.
like we don't realize how much time we have. And I was listening to this interview. I can't remember who it was, but they're talking about like how much time do you really have left with your parents? Especially if you're
Yeah.
working and you're away from them for so long. It's like
Yeah.
let's say they're gonna, God willing, they stay alive for like however many years. Let's say 30 more years. That's only 30 more Christmases. That's literally a
Yeah.
month. If you think about like just the time that you'll be spending like with them like right next to each other. I was like, oh shit.
Yeah.
And then what's even dumber too is just that I don't know. I just started like realizing I originally only opened my Instagram to follow meme pages. But like somewhere
Mm,
along the way, some of these meme pages just started posting like pictures of like random like hot girls. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. And then I just I
yeah.
didn't pay any mind to it for like maybe the first few months. But then they just kept doing it. I was like, oh, okay, you know what? I'll open the page. And I opened the page and I'm like, okay, they're pretty cute. So like I'll follow it, and then like next thing you know, like 6 months later, I'm following like 10 Instagram models that I've never met before. I'm just like
Yeah.
pressing this heart button that somehow makes me feel better. And like kind of I don't know, it just felt so gross. I'm like, oh my God, like what am I doing with my life? It's like this
Yeah.
this original good intention, just to follow fucking stupid memes, just became this weird thing of me just like ogling like women, or like ogling just like these different products that people are trying to sell me on social media. And I'm just like, wow, I've really just become like this other data point, or like this thing that these media companies are trying to sell to other people.
Yeah. I just remember it's like if I'd recommend anything on that, it's I think it's called The Social Dilemma on Netflix if you've seen it. It's a really good breakdown of them like
Mm,
interviewing either like ex Facebook employees or like psychologists and stuff. And it's just all about like how how they take your mind basically, and like
mm,
they're like scanning everything, like literally they like scan if you like pause with scrolling for like a fraction of a second longer, it
mm,
like takes note of that and is like, oh, they want more of this, so that like it slowly turns your feed into something you want, which is like I kind of get why, because obviously I would want that if that's how I would want it to be designed for me, as if, but it's also like makes it super addicting
mm,
so that you always see what you keep wanting to see. And I noticed too, if you start interacting with certain accounts on these websites, it um, increases their frequency in your timeline as well, because obviously the timeline is often not curated by time, like in time, in chronological order. It's like most important issues
mm-hmm.
in a semi chronological order, but it like cuts out a lot of extra things. I'm like, oh, like what am I missing now too?
Yeah.
But
You ever get that like weird itch or that weird fever where like you're just sitting let's say you're just sitting in a restaurant, and like your company had gone to the bathroom or something for like a time
Mm-hmm.
being, and then you like the immediate like reaction is just to like, it almost feels like this itch when you don't do it, but to like pull out your
Yeah.
phone and then check like whatever socials you're on, just to like refresh, or see like what the next big thing is, like even if it was like 5 minutes after you had just closed your phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hate that so
Yeah.
much, dude. I remember like back in 2017, there was a company that was literally selling like blocks of, I think, like lightweight metals that resembled the shape of phones, so that you could put
Hmm.
it in your pocket and still emulate the feeling of you having a phone in your pocket without having like the addictive qualities of like a bona fide phone. I was like, oh my god,
Damn.
like this is what we're driven to now. Our fucking monkey brains.
Yeah, I think I saw like a Tim Ferriss thing where he was like saying he uses an app that like posts for you now. So then he's never like actually on Twitter or Facebook or anything. You just send it to this app and then that app posts for you. And I was like, man, if like people like Tim Ferriss don't need social media, then like do I really need to distract myself with social media? And it's like, yeah, no, I find it fun, but like, is that fun that I should be using, or should I be like a more productive kind of fun, you
Well,
know?
the crazy thing is that like almost all like social media like gurus, or like the founders or the CEOs or whatever leadership like exists at the highest level, if they have children, they will not allow their kids to use the product, just because they know how like
Yeah,
addictive it is, and how like sort of danger it is, or how damaging it is to like one's like well-being. And it's crazy too when you look at the statistics regarding like depression, especially among like young girls, like developing girls,
yeah,
and
yeah,
like the levels of like depression and how they associate that with like increased social media use across like the past few decades. It's actually really sad because like
yeah, yeah,
there's nothing that they can do about it, and it exploits like this like weird primitive or like carnal instinct in all human beings, but especially girls, of just like seeking attention, or like seeking like
yeah,
validation. And sometimes a lot of times that just comes from like this little like button on Facebook, or like the heart or whatever, and you're always like, ooh, I got 100 likes 1 week, and then you post a new picture like a month later, you're like, oh, like it's down 75. What's happened? It's down to like
yeah,
only 75 likes. Why is that? Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with angle or whatever? It's crazy.
yeah. I think the theory. I think what I remember like seeing like the theory of that was like boys are like normally more a little more physical and more like physical contact type stuff. So like the reason why they commit suicide is being like physically bullied or whatever in
Mm.
school, and then like the girls suicide rates have increased. They used to be a lot lower than boys, and then they started increasing while the boys kind of stayed steady, is because they're more social. And so, yeah, like social media literally is part of their like kind of they're more geared to be social people so that they can't escape that social pressure, whereas boys can still just go home and they're physically separated, while girls they have like constant social connection so that
Mm.
they're always feeling that like social pressure.
Yeah, I think it's really strange, because I feel as though a lot of times, uh, and this is sort of just pure conjecture, where it's like I feel as though like from an evolutionary perspective, women are just more prone to seek like that sort of social validation, or they're more
Hmm.
sensitive to social cues. Because if you think about it, it's like, oh, if throughout time, and throughout, not just even the history of man, but like the history of all biological species, especially in species that the mother is responsible for, caretake of the child, of like their offspring or their progeny. It's like they have to be really sensitive to like the needs of their young.
Yeah.
And then also as a result too, because especially in mammals, there's that especially vulnerable period where females are responsible for like carrying the child, or like a burden of child, the burden of carrying a child. It's like, oh, they're also reliant on other people, whether it's like their mate or whatever, to help them acquire resources for like the nutrition that they need throughout the childbearing years.
Yeah.
And it's a shame too, because it's like from one perspective, it's like, okay, I get it. A lot of these companies, like, I mean, innovation leads us to like tremendous new heights in like humanity, but at the same time, it really exploits like our biology to the point where it just starts to cause all these damaging effects.
Yeah, I think that maybe one last point on this, but like I remember someone saying like it used to be that like social media started out as like an accent or like like a side thing to our social lives, like it was meant to like add to it, and now it's more like it's kind of evolved into being a lot of people's actual social like interactions, which
Yeah.
is kind of unfortunate. So it's like if we could get back to a place where it's like and more, like connecting us more rather than like that's our actual connections, I
Yeah.
guess.
Where it like enhances our life but doesn't it isn't
Yeah.
our life. What do you
That's
what do you think it would take for us to get back to that point? Or do you think that it's one of those things where you're trying to put toothpaste back into the tube after you squeeze it out?
yeah, I'd say it's definitely more the latter. It's either I think it's gonna be if we get away from it, it's gonna be more just like a social trend towards getting off of social media more and going back to in-person things, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're getting more and more online things. Like even like I always say this to my friends or whatever that like I feel like even like shopping is going to become more and more online, like more like Amazon, that I feel like physical stores are going to disappear, and like I feel like it's going to be more delivery. Like I can definitely see a future where you don't actually go to the grocery store and like everyone just has it delivered to them. And I definitely feel like COVID like accelerated a lot of that because I feel like a lot more people are now realizing like just how easy it is to do like
Yeah.
DoorDash and stuff already and stuff like that. Even I think about it sometimes, and I I don't think of it as that way, like to just to be disconnected, but it's more like, oh, like how much time would I save if I can pay like the extra $10 for someone to go bring me my groceries while I still like study every week, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you start to like you start to think, oh, what is my time worth? It's like if I'm making $10 an hour or something like that,
Yeah.
and it takes me an hour to do groceries. But if I just pay someone else to do it, you sort of just break even, you know. So at that point, it
Yeah,
just
yeah.
kind of becomes worth it. But if it's like you only make $7 an hour and it's like a $10 an hour fee, then you're like, okay, like this doesn't make sense. But if you're like making $100 an hour, like $200, then it's like a no
Mm,
brainer, right? Because it's like, oh, I could be making a net 90
yeah.
extra bucks instead. But anyways, back to the chapter. Um, all good. I noticed too, like especially when it comes to just being more self-centered, and I feel as though that's a weird thing to say too, especially in the 21st century in the West, where it sort of has this bad connotation of like being selfish or fulfilling your own needs first. But it's kind of he talks about this a little too, where it's like you have to do things that are good for you first, because if you don't do that, number one, no one else is going to do it for you, and also number two, it's not good for anyone else around you if you're just taking actions in your life that are harming yourself, because then you're no good to anyone, right? And now, not only that, like you're actually almost a sort of burden for other people too if you don't choose to take care of yourself. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I definitely see that where it's like, how can you help other people if you can't even like help yourself?
Yeah, it's
And
like
it's
that
like,
airline thing where it's like you put your own mask on first before you help the person next to you, because otherwise,
yeah,
you risk the incidence of, oh, now we have two people that are like suffocating, or like we have two people that are drowning instead of just
yeah.
like one person.
I feel like you hear that story all the time where it's like someone has like a baby like accidentally, or they like even if they did plan it, they're just like not. They feel like they're totally not ready, and they're like, oh shit, I can't get myself together. How do I get my like a child together? And like I feel like most people realize how I feel like once you have that like selective pressure that you're now caring for something else, like you put yourself together.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot too. Like especially in my friends, uh, who had unexpected pregnancies.
Mm,
And some of these people are like before they became fathers or before they became mothers. I was like, man, I do not see them. like
yeah.
like of all the potential roles they could fulfill, father or mother was definitely not in the
Yeah.
top five. Or it's like
Well, it's
I wouldn't put them on the draft for.
yeah, yeah. I was gonna say because like my brother was having like a tough time for a while, and like his therapist actually like recommended he get a dog, and like I think like him getting a dog like really did help him because now he's like, oh, like I don't know, maybe it's kind of like this chapter where it's like once you get a dog or a baby, you suddenly realize like, oh, I have to like do things for this, so I have to like take a little bit of responsibility, and then I think that kind of starts that ball rolling into other parts of your life where it's like, oh, I have to remember that I have to walk the dog twice a day and feed him twice a day and like take him to the vet, and then you just naturally realize like, oh, I have to like manage my time better. Okay, so how do I manage my time better for my dog? I
Mhm.
think that goes back to that I think it's like the second chapter that was like how care for yourself like you were caring for someone else. So I feel
Mhm.
like it's almost that way too, where you start to realize, oh, I need to, make these changes in my life to get myself on track so that I can care for another thing.
Yeah, it typically starts with like you starting with the one sort of responsibility that's beyond yourself, because he also says it in this chapter too, where it's like you're not your own slave. You can't just force yourself to do things just because you said so, right? Like
Yeah.
typically, like there's this sort of value structure, this value hierarchy, and then from the perspective of let's say your brother owning a dog, it's like you have this one locus of just order that you have to maintain, otherwise this thing dies. Or
Yeah.
this just because this animal just becomes like this feral beast that is a harm to not only myself but the people around me too. So it's like, okay, I got to take care of that. What do I have to do in my life such that I could continue to take care of that in a way that's sustainable, right? It's like, oh, I have
Yeah.
to, not only do I have to feed it and take it out for walks and take it to the vet, I also have to finance its food. I have to find a way to pay
Mm,
for like all those veterinarian visits too. Oh, that means I got to get a job. Oh, now I have a job with its own responsibilities. And I feel as though typically it starts with like this one little bit of order that exists in your world, and then as soon as that happens, it's like dropping it's like dropping like a salt crystal into like a hypersaturated solution of
yeah.
salt, right? As soon as that one lattice like falls into solution, everything around it just crashes into order, and it becomes like this beautiful like crystal of just shit where you're like, oh crap, I never knew this could have been a thing if I just like
Yeah.
took care of like this one little aspect of my life.
Yeah, and I feel like I find that even in my life where it's like if I start with like one thing a day that I force myself to do at like one time a day, I feel like that easily spreads to other things where it's like, okay, I have to work out or go for a run every day at 4. And as soon as I do that, I start to think, oh, well, if I'm going to take like an hour to work out every day, I need to, study for, I can't study during that time. So I got to do other things. And then it's like, oh, well, then how am I going to eat? So I have to eat at like 5 or 6. Oh, well, if I structure my day, I get the food ready to be done by the time I get back from my workout and shower and stuff, and then like I just find that it snowballs from there, and it's like, okay, well then I need to study from noon th- to like 3:30 so that I can get ready to work out. And it's like I feel like once you start getting that little bit of responsibility for one aspect of your life, it like quickly spreads to everywhere else, even if you don't
Yeah.
have like a dog or a baby or whatever.
Yeah, I feel that. Like, in the crazy thing, or at least from my end, is just how easy, like how, yeah, how readily available alternatives are. And what I mean by that is like I'll go through the same motions too. Where it's like, oh, I have to study X amount. I have to work out at this time. I have to eat at this time. And then there's like that little devil on my shoulder that's like, you could also not do any of that,
Yeah.
and then more days than I care to admit, I'm usually just like, yeah, I'm not gonna do that, even though
Yeah.
even though I know it's not good for me. And that's another thing
Yeah.
that I love that this chapter explores too, where it's the idea that it's like, how genuine is it whatever you're saying is. It's like, do you want to be better? And for the longest time, I always thought of like just being genuine, or like being honest or truthful, was like feeling a certain way in like your body, in your heart, in your mind, or whatever. But in this chapter, he's like, no, 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 fuck that. Like, genuine intent is reflected in like your action. And for the longest time, like, I mean, the words, like, if you write it out as a sentence on a sheet of paper, like, it makes sense to me. But like in the art of just practicing it and carrying it out, I really didn't get it, because I would still do things that I knew were bad for me. Like shirking off my responsibilities, not paying certain bills on time, getting punished for that, or not studying for certain exams or stuff like that. And it's like, no matter how deeply I felt like within myself that, oh, I know this is exactly what I need to do, for whatever reason at the time, I wouldn't do it. So now it's like I'm able to look back at myself, and also my intent and my actions at the time. I'm like, oh wow, what I said and how I felt and what I did were all just so inconsistent with each other that I was just not genuine with myself. And I think that was like a harsh, rude awakening.
Yeah, which I think I wanted to touch on this too. I think it's later in the chapter. I think it was page. I mean, obviously, all the books are different. If I remember right, it's a 93. I forget what page. I should have made a better note of it. Um, but it basically like goes into like how you need a little bit of dogmatism in your life. And I was thinking about that idea of like how I know like Jordan Peterson likes to avoid like basically endorsing. He doesn't like to endorse religion, and I find like one of my biggest criticisms of him is he like never has a direct answer to like um how do you say, whenever you ask him if he believes in God, like he never has a direct answer to that. But besides that, he always says like religion is like true enough. And I was thinking about how he says like religion needs a dogmatic element. I was like thinking how even if you don't aren't particularly religious, like even taking on a religious framework for your life and like acting it out as if you were can be like tremendously helpful. I know he often says like people who say they don't believe in religion, but you are. That was definitely in this chapter too, where
Yeah.
even atheists say like, "Oh no, I'm not religious," and he says, "Yes, you are, because of all your like all this cultural background and like how you actually live your life. You actually live your life as true to dogmatic religion as it is, even if you don't actually believe." And I was thinking, even if I didn't do that, because I feel like I fell away from a religion for a while, even though I wasn't going to church or whatever, I found that I was using other examples to make myself sort of dogmatic in a way, where I was looking at like Jordan Peterson or Jocko, or like how Joe Rogan like is super dedicated to working out and stuff, and I was like, oh, I could take on this like framework of
Right.
semi-religious, but it's more like a secular religious framework to make it really dogmatic, even if it's not the best for me. At least it's like a place to start.
Yeah, several things that he says to sort of, um, yeah, to sort of answer those questions whenever they're handed to him, is that, like, number one, he says he lives as if God exists.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was like so interesting, because another thing that he sort of, and I don't want this to seem like I'm speaking for him, because this is only my interpretation of what he says. Like, I still hold him to a very high esteem, but like my interpretation of that is, it doesn't matter like so much if like all of the events of the Bible were like if there was really like a guy named I don't know, like
If there
Joseph
was
or Mary, or like any
Yeah.
one of those things happening. It's like it could, and it could also not. But like the power in a
Yeah.
lot of those stories transcends what's real to the point where it's like so ingrained within our just like state of being as human beings. Like when we hear some of these stories, we just feel like a certain way, like at the core of like our soul, or whatever you want to call it. And it's like, wow, like I've seen this happen in my own life, or it's like I've seen someone make a sacrifice to better like other people's situations, or I've seen people take revenge upon like their family, and then they were just cursed with the consequence. You know,
Yeah.
it's like something to that effect where it's just it doesn't like he always says we have to be more sophisticated with what the definition of real is, because
Mm.
another thing that we could also say is like pain isn't real, right? And he says he says this in like one of the earlier chapters, but if you say that to someone who's like in agonizing like terrible pain, it's like, yeah, sure, pain is like a is like a series of chemical reactions that's interpreted by the brain, and there's like probably some level to which like you can extrapolate, or like you can quantify the degree to which you can replicate said pain. But like
Yeah.
to like another human being, like how do you quantify like sympathetic pain or like empathy? It's like a like you see someone like hurting a certain way because they just had like their leg amputated, and you really feel for them. It's like how do you describe some of those things? You know, it's not like a disease that just gets transmitted to one person or another. And it's like they're things that are like that are so real even though they're not tangible.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, yeah, we have to really rethink of what it means when we say real. And then the other thing too that I think he says, it's like uh, in any given person, like their highest rule, or like their like core philosophy as like a human being, acts to the same capacity to them that God does in religious people. So like let's say you have this rule, like your highest order rule is, oh, you're gonna treat others the way you want to be treated. You can say you're an atheist, but like you treat that rule to the same degree that like a Christian treats God, or like yeah, anyone like treats their God. So I think to sort of answer your question, or at least try to answer your question, that's sort of like what it sounds like you've experienced, where it's like even though you don't necessarily subscribe or append yourself to a certain religious ideology, there's still like value structures, or there's still certain ways that you've chosen to live your life, or like these rules that you've just chosen to not violate. And that's like pretty much the
Mm.
same thing of what God does in religion.
Yeah. I keep thinking, have you ever seen the movie Yes Man?
Is that the one with Jim Carrey where he has to say yes to everything?
Yeah. I feel like there's such a true thing at the end. I don't know. I haven't seen the movie in a long time. I remember it being pretty good. But like right at the end, he's saying yes to everything, and it like seems like his life is going great until he says like yes to like one too many things, and then it starts going downhill.
Hmm.
And I remember there's like a scene in the movie where he says no to like this ridiculous. I think he's like, because at the beginning of the movie he says no to everything, and then he sees the seminar and he says like screw it, okay, I'll say yes to everything. And I remember like halfway through the movie there's a scene where he says no to his like old neighbor lady who like basically offers to like have sex with him, and then like he immediately like tears his shirt in her door and like trips on the stairs and almost gets like attacked by a dog. And he's like, okay, well, and he starts saying yes to everything, and like goes great, and he meets like Zoe Deschanel, and they like start a relationship, and everything is amazing. And I can't remember the end, but either he keeps saying yes to a point where he starts getting in trouble for saying yes to things, like he like takes Korean lessons, and then like also he gives a loan to like a fertilizer company, so like the FBI starts coming and being like, what are you doing, making bombs for North Korea? And like and finally at the end of the movie, like I feel like this is such a true thing where he meets the guru again, because he's like, what the heck is happening, like my life's ruined again. And the guru's like, you didn't actually read my book, did you? And he's like, no, I didn't read it. And he's like, the first part of the book is saying yes to everything, but then realizing you can have to start to say no to everything. I feel like that's so true, where you have to like start this like dogmatic thing where it's like, okay, say yes to everything or do something almost religiously, even if it's maybe not the best in the
Yeah.
time, just to set yourself up. And then you start to, you know, chisel away to make like a better form. You know, like maybe the dogmatic element makes this like rough outline of a statue, and then you take the rest of your chisel and like put the fine details where you're like, oh, well, there's exceptions to this rule, or
Right.
there's, you know, or
And
this rule doesn't work for me, or I need to like tweak the rule or whatever to like really fix it. And I feel like that's part of this chapter too, where you start doing things really kind of almost rigidly change something every day, and you'll slowly like chisel away like what works best for you.
right, and I think that's the eternal conundrum of like tradition versus innovation, right? Where
Mm,
like a lot of times there's that phrase where rules are meant to be broken, and like that's
yeah.
true, but sometimes people use it to abuse power, right? I think it's true in the extent that like rules were still made by flawed human beings, and like not one human being or even a committee of human beings that institute a rule necessarily know how complex like the rule is, right? Because it's only based on human experience and human philosophy. But another thing too to that effect is because rules are meant to be broken, you have to like fully understand like the complexities of the rule before you break them. Like
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
feel as though like one of like a really good example of that is like any athlete that like just seems like beyond their time or like ahead of their time, like Wayne Gretzky like for hockey, or Michael Jordan of basketball. You know, people that
Yeah.
play a sport or like play within the confines of the rule, like Simone Biles. Like I
Yeah.
think that's like the most recent example to me that just comes immediately to mind, because like I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong too, someone fact check me on this, but it's like she was so good at like what she did that like the like Olympic athletic committee had to like change the rules of certain gymnastic things, because like literally she's the only person that can do certain things, and it literally wasn't fair to
Mm,
like anyone else. Like people that like had such a good understanding of like the basics of any particular art or craft or practice, to the point where it's like, okay, like this is what people have always done, this is what I'm gonna do, and like what I do are just so beyond like the bounds of the rules, to the point where we have to reestablish what the boundaries are to begin with in the first place.
yeah. I feel like that's why like going on that like sports analogy, that's why like some sports seem to get like so complicated at like especially higher levels like football or hockey. There's all these like weird rules where it's like, oh, you can only have this many guys on the line, or
Yeah.
in like hockey, you can only have so many past that whatever line it is. I forget how the rule works, or like, you know, like soccer, there's offsides and stuff
Right.
like that. I feel like at some point someone exploited that like tweak in the rule so long, so you know you had that structure of the basic rules, and then you realize like, oh, there's like a really unfair advantage to like said rule that you need to make a new rule or like tweak a rule to like fix and make the game better.
Yeah. When it comes to that sort of stuff too, especially with like truly exceptional people, I feel that is when like this rule also becomes like the most effective, like rule number 4, that is like
Yeah.
when it becomes the most effective, because now it's like, oh, there's this human being that's like within my domain of expertise that's so good, and it's like, why can't I be that way, you know?
Hmm.
And now suddenly like there's this quote that I absolutely love from Conor McGregor, where he's like, oh god, I get it right. He says something like, if you compete with someone else, you'll become bitter, but if you compete with yourself, you'll get better. And I'm
Mm,
just like,
yeah.
some like, especially because he's a mixed martial arts guy, and like, and you know too, just from like being a practitioner of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, where it's like, if you were to put yourself in a ring with like say a striker, or like someone who's really good at
Yeah.
kickboxing or really good at like Muay Thai or like any particular sort of wrestling, like they'll kick your ass when when you're playing a
Yeah.
stand-up game, right? But like if it goes to the ground, you know how to defend yourself, and now it's like anyone's game. Like it's, if anything, it'll probably like play to your strengths too. And it's like sometimes we're so fixated on like uh, the strengths of other people, and it's one thing to like
Yeah.
celebrate them. It's another thing entirely to be like, oh, I have to do these things just because like I need to be better than this other person, when that's not like the hand that you were dealt at all. Maybe you were like double jointed at the hips or something, and you can't throw kicks like everyone else can. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
what is it that I can do instead? Maybe I can become a really good like striker, really good at wrestling, or whatever it is, just within the domain of sports. And I think the more we compare ourselves to other people, it's almost like it's definitely a double-edged sword. I mean, the negative is definitely there, where it's like, oh, we're never able to realize our true potential because we're comparing ourselves to someone else. The positive
Yeah.
is that, oh, now I don't have to put in the hard work of establishing for myself what is like the next level for me, because I can just take this example someone else has set before me, rather than having to put in the work for myself to realize it. And it's comforting
Yeah.
too, because it's like look at almost any sort of like essay you've written for school. It's almost easier if you see someone else write it first, and then you get an idea of like how they write it, and it's like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe I can tweak some things, like, and organize it to the extent where it's really reminiscent of this other person's craft. But now you don't have to go through that hard, like, grueling work that's really uncomfortable, where it's like, oh, like, how like, what's an original
Yeah.
idea for me?
Which I feel like you need that at the beginning of like when you start a craft, but like once you start getting, if you actually want to get better or like be your own person in said craft, you need that. Like, so I was thinking of earlier this week of like the best metaphor I would see is like either like learning an instrument or like learning like art, like how to draw or something. Like
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you need to start by like copying other things, and I I see a lot of times how like young artists, they show like, oh, here's like my original works, and it's like, oh, they're just like copying like famous
Yeah.
comic book panels, or like they were copying like
Mm.
animation stills from other people, or like kind of almost, it's like just enough not to be plagiarism, but you're like, they would never come up with something on themselves. Or like when you're learning music, like a lot of people I see coming up nowadays and getting popular on YouTube and stuff that I've seen are not making their own unique things first. They're like being like, oh, I'm making all anime themes, but I make it heavy metal, or
Mm.
I, something like that. And then they slowly transition and realize, oh, like, what do I need to do to become like my own artist? And then they come out with this great album. I'm trying to think of this guy. I really like he came out with an album like really recently called, it's like something silly, like Starship Velociraptor. Is like the album. But like
It's
if you
crazy.
go on his Spotify, like almost everything on his Spotify is just what I said, like it's anime, it's heavy metal anime covers. So it's like all like really good music, and then I think he finally like just took it on his own to be like, okay, what do I need to do to become my own artist? And I feel like if we go back to that like that dogmatic religion thing, you need to start by copying or emulating someone else, but then you need to then turn it into your own thing to improve your life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, it's almost like this training wheel period, but at the same time, it's
Yeah.
like if you ride a bike with training wheels your entire life, there's so many limitations. Like you
Hmm.
can't do like certain tricks or whatever. You're literally only like stuck to doing whatever it is like the original purpose of the bike was, right? And that is to get from point A
Yeah.
to point B. But you can't do the thing where it's like, oh yeah, I can get from point A to point B, but I can also write it in cursive, or I can also do all these other crazy things, like do all this other weird bullshit that no one else has seen before.
Mm.
It's like I remember one of my teachers here. I asked him, like, it was something like, are there ever like original like ideas, or like all of our behavior learned? And he's like, no, no, no,
Yeah.
like almost all everything that we do is learned, like one way or another. But like
Yeah.
there are significant enough deviations from like seemingly trivial events to the point where you start to see something as like totally like nuanced, or something totally like different. And it's like that accumulation of like really small things. And I think that's such a
Yeah.
small population of people, especially within, well, maybe not even in the West, but like in people around the world. Because I mean, it's comfortable, right? And not everyone can be
Yeah.
excellent or extraordinary. That's like literally baked into the definition. Yeah, I think the artist thing is like a really interesting perspective. I never really thought of it that way, where it's like this, like you start by like if you're learning piano, you start by learning Beethoven or Mozart or like the classics,
Mm,
and then suddenly
yeah,
you're like, no, fuck that, I want to play some jazz, you know?
yeah. And then you're like, oh, I'm gonna write my own jazz, and then you're kind of
Yeah,
snowballing from there.
I
I
think
was
another.
thinking
Sorry,
I
continue.
was gonna, I was gonna say, I was thinking as you said that, like there's that whole like there's only like one story, and it's like that mono myth where it's like you're in your comfort zone, you leave your comfort zone, you overcome
Yeah, yeah.
something, and you return to normal. Like that's all stories, and I feel like I got into that phase too a while. Like both me and my sister were like super into movies and whatever for a while. And like at some point, I think you watch too much Cinema Sins and you start like thinking like, oh, all these stories are like super predictable and like I can tell you where the story's going forever. But then I think eventually you learn like, oh, it's not like in the end the hero's gonna win or something's gonna happen. And every once in a while there's like a tweak on it, which is like really appreciated. I really appreciate, but like a lot of times it's no longer the big plot beats because obviously those are going to be really similar from movie to movie, but it's the slight variations or like the new situations that those big plot beats like occur within that makes like a story good.
Is there a particular like a movie or like a movie series or like a movie genre that you're like referring to?
I mean, like you can almost say Marvel movies, but I feel like those are almost turning into like the same plot beats. I mean, like you can tell like the difference between like Iron Man and Doctor Strange is like almost the exact same movie if you really think about it, but like the differences in like the details makes those movies like fairly different
Mm,
scenarios, which you can enjoy them for their own differences. Like the slight variations in Tony's backstory with his like dad and like Obadiah Stane versus Doctor Strange dealing with his own arrogance in a different way. I
mm,
mean, you can distill them down to like basically like arrogant rich guy who gets like knocked down a few pegs and then has to like overcome like through his humility to like overcome whatever and become a better person at the end. But like the differences in the two stories is enough that you are actually invested in both characters, even though
mm-hmm.
they are almost like it's like almost a copy and paste, but they like changed from like technology to magic.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think to speak on like a point that you were mentioning earlier too, it's like you maintain like that core motif of like the hero's journey, and it does become predictable to an extent. And then there are also all these other attributes that you can like sort of superimpose onto the that core that bare bones structure of story. But
Mm,
it's like the way you fill in the spaces too that really colors the experience or that really differentiates one from the other, because it's like I feel as though that's so apt to just understanding other people. Like one of my favorite things is just like listening to stories, not like necessarily like fables or whatever, but listening to people's life stories, like listening to their perspectives. And
yeah.
like I've soon come to notice that like the more time I spent not trying to like espouse like my own beliefs, but really like spending time asking genuine questions and understanding other people's perspectives, like I really come to empathize with them more, and I really understand like why they are in life or why they believe in the things that they believe. And like a lot of that just had to come from me realizing, oh, I don't have all the answers. Like I only have the best set of answers for the set of experiences that I've had from my own experiences. Like there's this time where I lived with a guy that was he could trace his roots back to like the Southern Confederacy in the United States. That goes back to a period when there were warring states based on like conflicting ideologies. One of the biggest ones being the idea of maintaining slavery. So it was this war between like the North and the South, and the South was for, among other things too, maintaining the idea of just having slaves, and then the North was
Mm,
vehemently against that. But this guy that I was living with, like he had like flags, Confederate flags in his room. He's a really great guy, and I was living with several other people too. We're all like colored people, all of different races except for that one guy. And I mean, he treated us with nothing but love and respect. We got along with him so well. We played board games like every other weekend. We would go to like midnight runs to like hole in the wall like gas stations or restaurants to eat shitty food that was no good for our bodies.
Yeah.
But on top of all that, he would go like on some weekends to like Civil War reenactments, and he would take like the side of the Confederacy, and we always thought that was kind of weird. But like the more we asked him, he was like, no, this is like my grandfather fought in the war, or like one of his ancestors fought in the war, and when he goes through those experiences, he really like feels like this deeper connection with his lineage. And it's like so clear to me he's not racist or anything, because I mean he's living with a bunch of colored people.
Yeah.
But like he really does feel like the sense of like deep connection and just almost like a sort of respect for the past too. And it made me realize like really fast that not all people that fly this flag are inherently racist. They're really complicated like people with really complicated stories that if you look at a world through a certain lens, it's really easy to just look at that one person. And you're like, oh, like they're horrible human beings. They're supporting like the servility of a certain like group of people, and it's like, nah, it's like so much deeper than that. Even though there were elements of racism like within that history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know where that came from, but yeah, I think like especially when it comes to something like that too, you sort of it's sort of like the counter to this rule in that sense, where it's like instead of trying to elevate yourself and just focusing strictly on yourself, if you really want to understand someone else, you have to put yourself aside too, and like sort of just live in their shoes for a little while. So it's kind of weird because like I feel as though one of the hardest things that I have, something that I have a really hard time with when it comes to Jordan Peterson that I've mentioned in other iterations of this book club, is that sometimes like I'm not really able to sort of think for myself or like offer counterpoints here to what he's saying. But if we were to take that line of logic that we were mentioning earlier, where it's like you understand a rule to a certain degree where you're able to challenge or like really come to terms with like the limitations of a rule to the point where you're able to make nuances or alterations to the rule. That's sort of when you start to become your own person, and you don't just become like a mouthpiece for ideology.
Yeah. But I think, like we said, you need that dogmatic element. I mean, if we go back, I think, no, I feel like it's not profound from this chapter, but like I was just realizing, like I had a lot of time this week, so I like read it kind of twice. Plus, I was like kind of out of it for a little bit. I don't know if I was sick or something, but like I was like kind of foggy the first time I read it, and then I reread it. But like I even typed it out because I was like, I feel like there's something here, but I feel like it's obvious to the chapter, and maybe I'm just still foggy or sick or something, and like it's nothing that, but like if I was reading the beginning again, and he was talking about like like there's all these hierarchies, and we talked about hierarchies in the past, and it's like there's many of them in the world, but you can't like get to the top of them because there's always like someone who's better or like at the peak of that hierarchy there. And so like what do you do? And it's like, oh, you need to like make your own hierarchy, and so he goes into that where it's like, oh, so you have to be like the best you, like that that cliche, like be the best you that you can be or whatever, but like it's kind of true. That's like why cliches exist. But then it's like you have to be the best at your hierarchy, so like, oh, so then you have a peak you can climb, but you can't be that peak because if you're at the peak there's like nowhere to go and nowhere to improve, so you're not gonna like better yourself, or like your current peak is like really shitty, so it's like, oh, like what do I have to do? It's like, okay, so you have to like put yourself like down. You start with your own like ideal peak, and then you have to put yourself like not at that peak, so you're always working towards a peak that you never quite get there.
Yeah, I think that requires a lot of calibration too, because I mean the point of the peak isn't such that like it's the end all be all, right? It's just the stepping stone to the next big thing. But the crazy thing too, especially like in a super productive society, it's like a lot of times people use money as that sort of
Yeah.
barometer, and
Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of people that are like that too, where they're just looking for the next best job, not because like they find particular for fulfillment or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
just a fatter paycheck. And it's like at a certain point, I think there was like some statistic or some study done by some body of authority on economics, like in the United States, but they said something like, if when you make greater than $80,000 a year, like your quality of life uh, does not improve greatly. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't increase proportional to the amount of
Yeah.
money that you make above 80,000. And it's like, what are you spending all that money on? It's like,
Yeah.
how much time are you losing with your kids? And it's like sometimes you gotta I don't know. Sometimes, and that's part of the reason why they call it a rat race too, right? Where it's
Yeah.
you're so focused on getting to the end of the labyrinth or beating your compatriots that you forget about the bigger picture.
Yeah. I think that's like why all like religions or like ancient philosophies are always, I don't, there's not like a single one that says like, oh, your goal is to be like the richest or something. It's always like, if you go to Christianity, that's why like man is made in the image of God. And then like the ideal person in the biblical stories is Jesus, who is literally man and God. So you have this like metaphorical ideal to put at your own peak,
Mm,
which if you go back to like the dogmatic thing, it's like, yeah, there's a Christ head figure at your peak, but like you take that dogma to be get up and set up your peak or your like the hierarchy, and then you change it to be your own. Or like, like Plato or whoever, he says like you have to seek the good. So here's the your virtues. Um, Maybe we can read Plato sometime to like really dig into it. But like
yeah,
I forget like all the virtues he has. I think there was three. I'm trying to remember them. But like, it's like honesty, chastity, and something else. I can't remember. I'd have to like look it up. But it's like all these religion stuff, it's never like a peak where it's like money or power or anything like that. It's like, oh, being a good person will give you the
mm,
most fulfillment.
yeah,
And I think I mentioned this on an earlier podcast where I think it was Ecclesiastes where it was like Solomon or whoever is like going around. He's like, oh, I first was like partying all the time, and then I was super rich, and then I like looked for it in being like a super smart person, and then I looked it into all these different things, and I found like, oh, like true happiness came from like wisdom and becoming like a better person in the end. And I feel like that's kind of like the goal here is to like change your own life to become like a good person, maybe not in the eyes of everyone else, but like at least a good person in your own eyes.
yeah. I think the opposite of that is just, and he and Dr. Peterson also talks about it too in this chapter, where it's like the opposite of that is just uh, it verges on pathological. So
Hmm.
that's like the person who recognizes no potential for further development and growth, and it's like, oh, that person like will inevitably become a tyrant
Yeah.
just because they believe they're right and that there's no valid counter to whatever it is that their belief is, and suddenly they just become so rigid and stale in their ideology to the point where it not only harms them, but it also harms like the people that are within their immediate vicinity too. And that's something I really like about the way he organizes these rules and these chapters, because I feel as though it's really easy to just get in your own head when you're on a roll and you're talking about all of the redeeming qualities of a particular rule, but he really goes in and challenges his own rules in the extent that he offers like the opposite perspective, or like what were to happen at the logical endpoint of it's almost like a sort of rebuttal,
Yeah.
such that he's not just tooting his own horn or acknowledging no limitations to certain aspects of his rule.
Yeah. Which I think that's why he brings up, I think we talked about before, um, Raskolnikov, and like Raskolnikov took like that extreme example of like, oh, like nothing matters. Like I'll take like the true, like I think nihilist approach or like the true atheistic approach that like it doesn't matter. Like I should just do that. And like in the end, like he's driven basically crazy by like his guilt and not at least putting some responsibility on himself. Um, I read it before, it's been a long time, so I don't quite remember how it ends. I'd like to reread it, but
Mm.
yeah, basically the whole book is him just like being driven crazy that he's gonna get caught for like what he's done or like whatever happens to him, and he like it changes him so much that it kind of basically ruins his life, even though he is an atheist.
Yeah, I think it's really strange because there are also people that exist in this world that are just like they have personality disorders such or like characteristics about them that preclude them from feeling those types of emotion, you know. And those are
Yeah,
really like the people that, you know, I hate to say it, but like there's really not a room in society for them in some ways just
yeah,
because they refuse to adhere to the rules or respect the rights or respect the lives of other humans. So it's pretty crazy. But at the same time, I also think that that number of people is a lot smaller than we think. But
yeah,
there's also more people than we know, or more people than we can estimate that fall under that category. It's kind of weird, but
yeah. I wonder what how you treat someone with I think for adults it's antisocial and for kids it's conduct disorder if I remember right. Like I wonder like what is the actual treatment?
a
I'll have
lot
to
of it isn't
look
medication
into it.
unless they have like psychotic symptoms. Like a lot of it is
Yeah.
actually just either you can't do anything about it and you try and maintain like a healthy like patient doctor relationship to the point where you know
Hmm.
they can still like learn civilized behavior, but then other than that it's like there's only so much things that like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectic behavioral therapy can do, just because like at
Yeah.
that point they're already adults and they're so concrete in like their habits and their modalities of thinking that there's really nothing you can do to them. A lot of times you find these people in prison for like the rest of their life, you know, and it's a
Yeah.
shame because I feel as though on one hand like the sort of like the zeitgeist for like the state of like perception of mental health is shifting to the point where people are becoming more accepting and more welcoming to discussion of things like depression and anxiety, but like
Hmm.
a huge portion that people just don't talk about enough in my opinion is what about like the people that are schizophrenic and crazy and like almost there's an overwhelming overrepresentation of schizophrenia in homeless patient or homeless people,
Yeah.
and it's like no one talks about that
Yeah.
because what happens like these people just become too overwhelming for their families to the point where they just get kicked out of their homes or they're not able to like maintain jobs. Or like what about people with terrible personality disorders and antisocial personality disorder, or you know anything that's like detrimental to society? These people deserve like our sympathy just as much because you know if you were to look at their life story there's probably nothing they could have done in
Yeah.
their experiences that led them to the point where they're behaving like in a way that violates the rights of other humans, you know. And I feel like we have to really push ourselves, and we have to really push ourselves to the point where we can understand people even if they do absolutely reprehensible or deplorable things, you know.
Yeah. I feel like for those people there has to be like a balance where it's like, okay, you're like so for lack of a better word, you're like so messed up that like you can't function normally, so that we have to take a little bit of your rights away for
Right.
your own benefit. But like that, I really don't like that argument because then you can take that argument and start applying it to like a bunch of things, like where it's like, oh, like we have to force you to do X, Y, and Z. Like we have to force everyone to do X, Y, and Z for the betterment of you and everyone else. Where it's like, where do we draw that line where someone is competent to make the decisions versus like someone who has like obviously like obvious schizophrenia that's like ruining their life, where we're like, okay, this person's like an obvious example of like, okay, we might have to take a little bit away a little bit of your rights and like force you to take a medication to keep you functioning in society, or maybe even admit you to some sort of like facility that is like so that you can function and live like
Right.
semi-normally, like I know like the history of like a lot of these things is terrible, or there's like massive abuses, like you watch like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and you're like, Jesus, that's like terrible, or like you read about these things, or like how like people in these facilities are treated, or even if it's like not treated badly, it's like just so underfunded, that they can't get good treatment or good resources there. So then these things just happen, which is like terrible.
Yeah.
So it's like there has to be like a happy balance where we can take like these edge cases and either take a little bit away of their freedoms to help them just to improve their lives. But like I said, I really don't like that argument to take away freedoms, because then what else does that apply to, you know?
Yeah, I think that should be like a last resort, and
Yeah.
we should make every attempt to avoid to make sure that it is a last resort, because
Yeah.
as soon as it becomes precedent, like you bet your ass someone's gonna abuse that.
Yeah.
Like it's so easy, and that's part of the reason why precedent exists in the first place. It's to handle like these marginal cases that no one knows what to do with, and suddenly it becomes like the standard of practice. And now suddenly it's like, okay, maybe several decades down the line, someone finds an exception to even that rule too.
Yeah.
And now suddenly you have like this slippery slope that everyone talks about.
Yeah.
But
Because I
yeah,
was trying to think like how, like in my own head, like here, like how would you treat those people who like violate social norms like that, where it's like either you have to hope they're logical enough that you can talk them into like behaving like normally, to be like, okay, this is like the best for you. Yeah, think about it logically. I know you don't care about other people, but you have to treat other people as if you cared
yeah,
so that you
that's a
can
good way of
function
putting it.
normally. If not, like if we cannot get you to do that, like I guess we have to lock you away or like do something. But it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll look into that this week if I have time or remember, just to be
Right.
like, how do you
Well,
treat that?
well, there's one thing to have like a personality disorder, and then it's another thing entirely to just be a straight up criminal, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
sometimes people like even with like better judgment too, or like high order thinking that's more congruent to like uh, what you would want to be a normal person in society, and it's like they still acknowledge, or they still preserve their sense of self-importance and self-preservation over the benefit of other human beings, or even at the expense of other human beings.
yeah,
So I think it's really difficult to find that distinguishing line, and I feel as though, especially with like public perception too, like something that kind of triggers me a little bit, is that like whenever someone says anything that's vaguely like medically related, they'll be like, I'm not a doctor or anything, but, and it's like, I don't think number one, you need to be a doctor to have an opinion on this thing. And also number two,
yeah,
a lot of doctors don't even know what to do like with like certain things too. I mean, there's a certain level of like, I suppose like medical or like even legal literacy that comes with just like the nature of the job. But it's so unrealistic to expect all doctors to know every detail of every
yeah,
aspect
yeah,
of every every component of care, especially like psychiatry, since it's like so poorly characterized.
yeah.
But yeah, it's
Mm,
tough. I think it requires, if anything, I think it requires like a higher level of like medical and like legal literacy in the general population, and not so much just on behalf of professionals. You know.
yeah. Which I don't know how you'd like spread that out, because obviously we're living right now through trying to get everyone vaccinated, and there's like so much like should say not information, disinformation that's going around, that you're like, how do we treat people to either not treat people, like teach people to either be at least a little more critical, or like making better judgments than they are currently, just to like improve society itself, without having to take away like fundamental freedoms.
Yeah.
Because obviously, like I said earlier, I really hate the idea of taking away anyone's freedoms for anything. But like, you know, there's starting to, sometimes you see that argument, and it becomes a little more enticing when it's like, Jesus, like we have to do something here, and it's whatever we're doing is not working.
Right. Well, to bring it back like full circle and back to the core of Rule 4, to sort of wrap things up here, I
Yeah,
wanted to ask you a question. So like the entire idea of this chapter was to find like this sort of value structure within your life, and then just focus on that within yourself too. Like
yeah,
what would you say to another person that's like say a young adult, or like a teenager becoming an adult, that's just trying to figure out their life, who doesn't know what's like important, or like who has a hard time like creating that value structure for themselves, but they still want to do right by the world or by themselves or by their family. Like what would you say to that person like that?
I think what we were talking earlier is I think find someone successful in whatever you want to do and start by emulating that person. And
Mm.
like that chapter says, I think I did find it where it's like that's the point of um yeah, it's like is it is therefore necessary and desirable for religions to have a dogmatic element. So I think if I would say, if I could go back and like meet myself, like just finishing high school or whatever, and be like, okay, you need to find someone who's successful in either your field or just successful in general, and like mimic mimic what they do almost dogmatically to be successful, and then like start slowly changing everything like to improve yourself, and then like or if I was like really struggling or down, like I've had a few moments in those life that's like, okay, like tomorrow just do something better than you did today, and like
Mm.
start from there, which I think is like the two like kind of halves of this rule is like the form that structure to work off of, and then also if you can't or you do kind of have a structure going, just pick something, anything to like improve tomorrow. It's like, okay, you started school, you studied only an hour today. See if you can study like for an hour and 15 tomorrow. Or, it's like, oh, you didn't go to the gym at all, like starting college or whatever. Start by going once a week or even just like, even if you have to do like the bare minimum. I know this happens like all the time. I think Jordan Peterson's mentioned it, but I've seen it mentioned by a lot of people where it's like, just do anything that's like stupid simple to start
Mm.
for anyone.
Set the
If
bar
someone
low.
came to me, yeah, like if anyone came to me and was like, man, I'm in the dumps, I'm like failing everything. There's no point. I'd like, okay, you need to start, like do something stupid simple, like just walk to the gym, like even if it's that, or drive to the gym and then drive back home or whatever it is. If you're on campus, like walk to your school's gym and just walk back. Like even if it's something stupid simple like that, I can't tell you like how long, like how far that goes, even if you just try and get into that mindset of like improving it, every day.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree,
I feel like that would be my two. Yeah.
and I think to like tie it back into like a previous rule too that he mentioned, where it's like treat someone else like treat yourself like the way you'd treat someone that you're responsible for.
Mm,
And it's like another aspect too about that is, especially with setting the bar low, is self judgment. Like I feel as though a
yeah.
lot of times people will be like, not necessarily, oh, how pathetic. It's like, how pathetic am I that I have to merely just go through the actions of walking to the gym, not even like picking up weights or like doing bench press or like doing something small or even stretching, but like just walking to the gym. How
Yeah.
pathetic am I to do that? And it's like, think about if you were talking to like your best friend who's like struggling with something similar. Would you call them
Yeah.
pathetic? Would you like
Yeah.
get on their case for trying to do trying to do better by themselves, and but starting with like this really low threshold? It's like, nah, like everyone's got to
Yeah.
start somewhere, you know. Like even people like Arnold probably started. You won't see pictures of it, right? But that doesn't mean it's not
Yeah.
real. Where he started off like super
Yeah. Yeah.
small, or like everyone came off as like a smaller person before they got better, you know.
Yeah.
And that's like
I
something
mean,
too
it's
that I've noticed like in other circles, whether it's like talking about like breaking bad habits, addiction. It's like uh, the only criteria for you to like be a part of like this program or like any sort of path to getting better is just wanting to be better, you know.
yeah. I would say it's if you like distilled that all into like a nice like pithy saying, it's like it's better to make a small increment than try and aim for a big change and fail is like what I would like shorten it down to.
Yeah, I think there's an yeah. I couldn't have said it better, but yeah, that's gonna be all from us for this week, and hope you guys are all tuning in for rule number 5 next week. Peace.